Hi and welcome to the second episode in Rise Like a Phoenixx, the episode from Phoenixx Records. I'm your host Alfie Chevins, and with me today I've got two special guests. I've got Mitch Abnett, who heads up our A&R department at Phoenixx Records, and I've also got Alex Lee, who heads up our marketing department. Today's subject that we're discussing is what era was best for music, and we're going to kick straight off by talking about the 1960s. So gents, I just wanted to get your opinions. Who do you think are the influential bands in the 60s, and what do you think the 60s did for progressing music? Alex, I'll come to you first.
So I think the bands that come to mind for me would be the Beatles, Rolling Stones, and also the Who. All three of them being like British bands as well. But then I also think about the Kinks as well, because they kind of paved the way for more rock and roll stuff, carrying on from the 50s as well with like Chuck Berry as well, but they kind of paved it in a way different direction, because their lead guitarist I know used to literally break his amplifier to actually make sound distorted. So a good example of this is You Really Got Me. So up until that point you couldn't actually record anything with distortion with a guitar, because the guitar pedals weren't a thing. So nowadays you've actually got that just because he started that. So
yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great point as well. The Kinks are often a band that's kind of forgotten in the 60s, because obviously you've got bands like the Beatles, Rolling Stones, you had a little bit of the Who come out as well, and bands like the Kinks maybe got lost slightly because, you know, the Beatles, certainly the Rolling Stones were massive.
yeah.
Obviously you've got Beatlemania, but really I think in the 60s, like you said, we've got that emergence of electric guitar music really for the first time properly in songs. As you said, there was a bit of Chuck Berry in the 50s, but nothing really like we saw in the 60s, and people really went mad for it as well. Obviously the swinging 60s as well, you know, style was very much something that people were conscious of, and the Beatles seemed to just tick every box and appeal to lots of people on quite a wide basis. Favourite song from the 60s, Alex?
I'd probably say either Come Together by the Beatles or All the Day and All the Night by the Kinks.
Yeah, great songs. Mitch, you got a favourite song from the 60s?
I like Neil Diamond's Sweet Caroline.
Yeah, right. Great song. I mean, we've seen that come back time and time again, era after era. That's kind of one of those songs that lives through the ages. I know my band play Sweet Caroline as our last track when we're gigging, just because it's a song that everyone knows, and it kind of really gets people pumping. I think we saw it when the Euros were on last year as well. That seemed to be the anthem of the English team, and I think Northern Ireland or Ireland had used it in the Euros before as their kind of anthem. So a big football song as well, and I suppose another big football song that we haven't mentioned yet is You'll Never Walk Alone by Jerry and the Pacemakers from the 60s. Obviously that's been adopted by Liverpool Football Club, and in recent times as well I think Dortmund have adopted that song. So yeah, some really great songs in the 60s. Let's move on now and talk about the 70s. This was an era where we had kind of the emergence of psychedelic rock. You know, music was getting a little bit more experimental. You had things like Woodstock, the big festival in America, so there was maybe some more, not leniency on drug use and things, but I think people were more free and open about doing it because there were lots of people kind of trying new things. And I think the 70s, you know, was when music became slightly more expressive, and it maybe pushed boundaries and norms that we'd seen in the 50s and 60s that were still kind of adhered to. Obviously we had things like IRA bombings in the 70s as well, so there was lots of kind of patriotism, nationalism coming through, and I think in a lot of songs from that era you can hear that, certainly in British music. Alex, let's go to you again. What kind of bands in the 70s for you would you go back and listen to now?
For me it'd probably be Led Zeppelin, and also Black Sabbath as well. But what I also would say as well is like the Vietnam War played quite a big part of it, because it meant that people kind of not revolted, but wanted to go against the American government quite a lot more. And so I think that influenced the music in terms of like being more political, and also, as you said, being more expressive. The politics definitely played a part in that.
For sure.
That wasn't really there in the 60s. So it definitely paved the way for kind of speaking your mind through music, I think.
Yeah, definitely. I would agree with that. Obviously, something else we had, you mentioned there with Black Sabbath, and that was kind of, I suppose, an early emergence of kind of what metal was going to look like. Obviously, we know Ozzy Osbourne, absolutely mental, and I think probably still recovering from his antics back then. So, that's an example of someone pushing the boundary within his life. But then I think that was also expressed in their music as well. But then on the other side of that, we also had the emergence of things like disco and Nile Rodgers and Chic, and some really influential producers were coming about then. Obviously Phil Spector had done some stuff with the Beatles in the 60s, and then the 70s just kind of continued that. But yeah, disco was a big genre then.
Well, even songs like Staying Alive by Saturday Night Fever and Night Fever itself, they're still played to this day and still really popular in the 1970s.
Yeah, so obviously the Bee Gees, and we saw a lot of kind of disco music and rock music having impacts within films as well. You've got stuff like Grease, as you said, Saturday Night Fever, John Travolta, big kind of disco sex symbol. Would you agree?
Don't know if I go for disco, but definitely a sex symbol of that era, yeah.
So I suppose in the 70s things were, it comes back to that leniency on people being able to be more expressive. I think John Travolta at that time as well, he also had kind of a kind of a feminine style to him that maybe we hadn't seen in men before the 70s. And I think certainly going into the 80s, we'll go on to discuss that. People were starting to, men certainly be more feminine, and women were being more masculine. But it came away from the 60s where men were men and women were women, and that's what they were expected to be, to going into the 70s when people could be more of who they wanted to be, and they could look at music as an art form rather than a form of entertainment. Okay, so let's move on. Let's talk about the 80s now. What kind of immediately jumps to mind? Let's go to Mitch. What immediately comes to mind when you think of the 80s? What kind of styles of music, maybe the instruments that are used? What do you think?
I think live music or rock music was definitely really popular in the 1980s, and a lot of the music that I still listen to today. And although my main genre is electronic dance music, I would say my secondary genre to listen to is 1980s kind of classic rock music. The songs that were kind of you instantly think of is Don't Stop Believing, Journey, Guns N' Roses, Sweet Child O' Mine. Tracks like that, Living on a Prayer, Bon Jovi, a lot of those kind of tracks you still hear on the radio now, and they're not really being taken off anytime soon because they're still really popular.
Timeless classics, I suppose, aren't they? Alex, what about you? What kind of genre instruments come to mind for you, and what bands would you say had kind of defined the 1980s?
Instruments wise, I'd say probably synthesizers are definitely a big thing in the 80s, especially with the pop music as well, as the chart music in the 80s was basically either classic rock, a little bit of thrash metal with Metallica and Megadeth as well, and also
Iron Maiden perhaps?
Yeah, Iron Maiden as well, yeah. They're definitely sort of on the sort of border of being metal, I guess, in some ways as well, and I think
favourite metal song from the 80s then? Anything that sticks out for you?
Probably Fade to Black, which is from Ride the Lightning by Metallica, which is 1986, I believe.
Alright, okay. I suppose we also had bands that are kind of maybe forgotten a little bit at the start of their career, but I think AC/DC were 80s as well. You had Bon Scott, I think, was still fronted them at the time. Is that right?
So 70s, they released their first album. They started in 1974, I think. But then they sort of, Bon Scott died in 1980, which was a year after Highway to Hell, the album came out. And so they released Back in Black, sorry.
Back to Black, that's Amy Winehouse.
Yeah.
I don't think she was alive in the 80s. Certainly not releasing music.
Yeah, because they had Back in Black came out in 1980 with Brian Johnson as well, as the vocalist who replaced him.
Yeah, so I suppose we see in the 1980s then with bands like AC/DC, it was kind of a rebirth for them. And I suppose in the 90s, 80s, that was kind of more accepted. If you look at Kiss, for example, massive rock band in the 1970s, I know that when it came to the 80s, they were starting to lose their appeal because so many people were starting to listen to disco music, and so the song "I Was Made for Loving You" by Kiss, that's actually their attempt at a disco song to be more appealing to a different audience, and it's actually their most streamed song on Spotify, which I find really interesting. But let's talk more about kind of electronic music since we have the first kind of proper emergence of house music. Also 80s hip hop came about, and style and individuality, I think, becomes really important in the 80s. We can go from bands like Motley Crue being rather big, and Metallica, you said, to super pop bands, Duran Duran, Human League, Spandau Ballet, New Romantics, and as I said, the rock bands were kind of starting to lose their appeal slightly, so they had to adapt. And I think if you look at bands like let's say Europe, for example, the band that did the Final Countdown, even perhaps Survivor, you could say, who did Eye of the Tiger and a couple of other big hits, they're having to adapt, and so they're becoming slightly more feminine, like the disco bands, while still keeping their hard edge. I just wonder what you kind of make of that, and how bands had to adapt, and how for a lot of them it actually was the defining thing in their career, because it gave them that resilience, that hard edge to carry on and have a prolonged appeal.
I think bands like Bon Jovi, I noticed, did this quite a lot in the 80s, because their guitarist Richie Sambora started using a lot of effects, and they were effects like a talk box, which weren't really used very much in the 70s or 60s really at all. And so he started using those effects with the guitar to kind of make it sound more electronic. And they also used to have a keyboard in a lot of their songs as well, not only just live but in the studio. And so I think, going back to what you're saying about having to adapt, they definitely kind of incorporated pop elements into it. Yes. Still maintain their rock kind of origins, I guess you could say.
Also, when you were mentioning like the development of like synthesizers and stuff like that, like that's what evolved house music, and I also discovered deep house music, which then after years of evolution and different sound designs being created from the synthesizers, at the late 1980s, that's when techno started to become a thing as well, which is like similar kind of tempo but different sound design, and like but it's still that kind of 4 on the floor drum pattern with the kick.
I think another thing about the 80s as well that we haven't maybe mentioned yet is obviously we had the Falklands War, miners' strikes, and there was kind of a lot of opposition towards politicians and politics at that point. We'd seen maybe in the 60s and 70s there was some kind of folk music with artists like Bob Dylan and things, Joni Mitchell, which were kind of like protest songs. But as we moved into the 80s, I think people were less worried about the fallout from it, and so protest music became more popular. You bands like Dexy's Midnight Runners, I think, Elvis Costello, even slightly, perhaps you could say, were wanting to protest against what was happening. I was just wondering if you've got any thoughts on that, and on how politics influences music, and if there's anything that stands out particularly from that decade that you could see influencing bands and music of that era.
I think the 80s in Britain, for me politically, is quite similar to the 70s in America, in the sense that America with the Vietnam War was very much so in the 70s and, well, in the 60s as well, but like, it's very much America focused in terms of the resentment. Whereas because the Falklands War was pretty much just Britain versus Argentina, it was basically just anti-sentiment towards the UK government. And so I think that also combined with Margaret Thatcher as well, kind of making the class divide a lot greater than it already was. It definitely didn't help anything in terms of the music, but in a way it did, because it meant people could express themselves better.
Yeah,
also,
I suppose.
Sorry,
go on after you, mate.
I was just say, in regards to the like political kind of that you were mentioning as well in the 1980s, I think that kind of made more people write songs about like the government or people in power. So, for example, Rage Against the Machines in the 1990s, I'd say that was maybe inspired by 1980s events.
Yeah,
like the kind of band name.
Yeah, I think as well, one thing we haven't mentioned yet as well is punk music. We saw kind of the emergence of it in the 70s, but then in the 80s it became a really big thing with bands like the Ramones. Again, coming back to that style and individuality, everyone had their own kind of group in the 1980s. You were either mod, rocker, I know that's kind of 60s, but then you've got your punks as well, you've got your new romantics. There was always something for everyone in the 80s, and you could kind of be whatever you wanted to be in. Hair, your dress sense was what kind of identified you, really. Okay, let's move on now. Let's start talking about the 1990s. This was when we saw the emergence of Britpop. We had grunge bands as well, and football hooliganism was really on the rise. Also in the 1990s, trance started to become globally popular. We'd seen a little bit of trance before, but this was when it really started to take off. And also we saw the emergence of some boy bands and girl bands, Spice Girls for example. So let's go to Mitch. For you, what stands out in the 1990s? Are there any bands in particular that interested you? What did you kind of, or what do you like to listen to now from the 1990s?
I listen to quite a lot of like music from Tiesto. Although I'm not a massive kind of trance fan, I just kind of because a lot of the music that he makes now is more modern to kind of fit into like chart music. But like some of the classics that he made, like I just like to listen to on mixes on YouTube. But then also like the Backstreet Boys. Still listen to songs from them as well.
A karaoke classic?
Yeah, exactly. So I still listen to a lot of their tracks, and especially when they're on radio. But I'd say, probably trance music, because it kind of gives you that euphoria feeling when you listen to it, which is what me and Alex were speaking about yesterday. Because Alex was speaking about trance music, and I said to him, because of like the kind of synths and the sound design and the leads, the kind of big chord build-ups. And they seem to be like really uplifting. It gives you that feel-good kind of vibe. So I'd say trance is probably one of my favourite genres that evolved and became one of the most popular electronic dance music genres of the 1990s.
Yeah, it's that euphoria feeling, isn't it, that you get from trance music. Obviously you've got big clubs as well. I mean, for me, the 1990s, if there was a single city that I could say kind of defined what 90s music was all about, it would probably be Manchester, because there were so many bands from in and around Manchester. You've got Blur, Oasis, The Verve, who were, I think, Wigan based, so that's only down the road. But then you've also got these nightclubs that are starting to play more electronic music, more trance music. You've got Hacienda in the centre of Manchester, and people were kind of, really living it up in the 1990s. Alex, for you, what kind of springs out from the 1990s? What do you like?
So I'd probably say mainly like grunge. So it's very much Seattle based as well. From America.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, so grunge all started in Seattle basically with Soundgarden predominantly, and then you got Alice in Chains, which were more heavy metal kind of influenced, but they were still grunge. And then of course you got Nirvana as well, which were massive. So yeah, I'd say Seattle definitely paved the way for a lot of that. And I think I did watch an interview once with Alice in Chains. They were saying about it because in Seattle they kind of didn't have much of a music scene, and so that kind of paved the way for them with grunge because it kind of meant they had something.
Yeah.
It wasn't like they were in LA where they had like the atmosphere of the whole place. Seattle didn't have anything at the time, so grunge was very much like a platform for them to kind of get Seattle on the map.
So if someone spoke to you now and they had no idea what grunge was, how could you sum it up for them in just a couple of sentences?
I'd say it's mainly just very sort of heavy guitars, sort of around about maybe 120 BPM or something, maybe a bit less than that. But it's just based on sort of not caring. It's kind of like punk but metal. Yeah. It's kind of hard to explain in that sense. You kind of know it when you hear it.
Do you think it's another kind of form of protest music, or do you think it goes against anyone or groups of people individually, or do you think it's just an expressive form of music, an expressive genre?
I'd say it's mainly expressive in the sense that when I've listened to grunge before, it's kind of like somebody screaming in their mind and they're trying to express it in a song. It's not them trying to like have a go at the government. It's usually just whatever they're feeling at that moment, they'll write down, put it in the lyrics, and they'll sing it. Very much Nirvana's like that actually, because Kurt Cobain I think used to write about his own kind of experiences and just put them in the songs.
I think one thing we haven't spoken about as well in the 90s is music videos are starting to become a real part of an artist's appeal and a song's appeal. In the 80s we were starting to see things like the video for Thriller, for example, for Michael Jackson, but in the 90s every band is now releasing a video with their music, and it's an integral part of what makes that song special and individual and popular. And I was just wondering if there were any music videos in particular that maybe stood out for you guys. For me, one that I always think back to from the 90s is the video for Park Life by Blur, just because it was just a little bit different. It had a mix of rock music and a little bit of rap in there with the bloke from EastEnders. So are there any videos from the 90s that stick out for you guys?
For me it'd be Bittersweet Symphony by The Verve.
Yeah.
Because you've got Richard Ashcroft walking through like a street basically, and there's always like those obstacles, he just doesn't care. That, even though it's quite a simple video to do, it's quite a symbolic one, because just like the sort of carrying on his day without caring, which I guess suits the song as well.
And that's a music video I think that's been parodied so many times as well, and it's one that does always kind of stick in your memory. It's one that's timeless, really. Mitch, any favourite videos for you at all?
Not music videos in the 1990s. There's quite a few in the 2000s that I prefer.
All right, okay.
I usually 1990s video. I kind of just have it on a mix or something.
Fair enough. The other thing in the 1990s as well is I mentioned it briefly about football hooliganism, but bands like Oasis, The Verve, Blur, The Lars, again another Manchester band, really all promoted, whether on purpose or inadvertently, this idea of football hooliganism. And in '96, obviously we had the Euros hosted over here, big football tournament, and it was a time for lots of football songs as well that came out. I think Simply Red was the band who recorded the anthem for the 1996 Euros, which was We're In This Together, I believe, and yet it was overshadowed by Three Lions, for example, and World in Motion was early 90s, but those football songs have lasted throughout time as well. Why do you think that is?
I think it's just because when a song gets associated with football hooliganism or even just in like national team, it seems to just like radiate with the fans, because you'll have like somebody's dad might have like had it singing it in Euro 96, and then their son might be singing it now when they're in Wembley or whatever,
Yes.
So I think it definitely passes down generations a lot easier when it's like associated with a sport.
Yeah, I suppose you've got that togetherness as well, haven't
Yeah.
you? That football brings. Okay, let's move on now. Let's talk about the noughties. We're coming into the post-grunge era now. Talent shows are starting to be more popular with things like Pop Idol, The X Factor, Britain's Got Talent even started in the noughties, and you've got this kind of conveyor belt of pop music coming out. You can maybe say that there were more electronic influences in pop music. We see more and more boy bands, and music production is starting to get better as well. So we're getting more people moving away from using tape because DAWs are becoming more popular and accessible and less expensive, and with better computers and software, more people can make music from home. The other thing we see as well is people are starting to use iTunes a lot, but then with iTunes, people are starting to rip and burn their own CDs on the internet, and then you're getting pirate sites like LimeWire, Pirate Bay, Napster I think was one as well, where you're getting people kind of illegally streaming music for the first time. So let's first talk about post-grunge. Alex, you should be our resident expert on that. I was just wondering if you could give us kind of your opinion on what happened to grunge in the noughties, and maybe why we don't see it as much in popular music anymore.
Well, I think because grunge was very much a sort of movement in the sense that it was just moodiness within like alternative rock. Whereas when it got to 2000s, they not people grew out of it, but there was kind of like a attitude towards, oh, maybe we shouldn't be moody anymore, maybe we should be uplifting. And so I think a big part of that was Foo Fighters, because of course their drummer, the drummer for Nirvana is now the singer for Foo Fighters, Dave Grohl. So the fact that he was in a grunge band and now is doing post-grunge, although they're more kind of alternative rock now, it just kind of reversed the attitude, I think.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point you make as well. I suppose because Nirvana were such kind of an influential band in the 90s, and then Dave Grohl goes from doing one thing to another. He's almost kind of taken Kurt Cobain's role without wanting to, I think, in the noughties, and he's moved away from grunge. You're saying that it's kind of maybe because of their influence and seeing him as an idol, it becomes less popular as a genre. Is that kind of what you mean? Yeah,
I think so. I think a lot of people who listen to Nirvana might have actually noticed that he started Foo Fighters. I mean, I know Foo Fighters didn't start in 2000s, it was like the late 90s, but
when they became popular,
yeah, when they became
mainstream,
because their debut album was late 90s, but even though they were still good then, they really hit like the sort of chart music era, I guess you could say. Which obviously at that point was hard because pop music was getting a bit more EDM focused, and so rock bands had to stand out. And so, I guess people who used to listen to Nirvana probably noticed he started it and thought, oh, I'll give that a listen. And
excellent. Yeah. Okay, Mitch. I was just wondering if you could talk about maybe some more influential electronic songs, perhaps from the noughties. I know one you mentioned before recording was Eric Pritt's Call on Me, which is a cover of, or it samples tracks from Valerie by Steve Winwood, which was 80s or 90s, I'm not sure. But that video had a lot of kind of, I think we all know the video, it had a lot of kind of sex appeal. And I think people associate kind of electronic music, festivals and sex appeal all in one at this point. I was just wondering if you've got any comments on that at all, perhaps.
Well, yeah, I think like after the millennium, there's kind of like a heavy, a lot of people at festivals and clubs taking a lot of like drugs, especially with the like evolution of like techno and trance, and the UK club life. There's like with like and also the development of like new kind of pills and like drugs to take. I think a lot of people were taking more stuff and experimenting more because there was new stuff on the market. Also, with other influential tracks that you were mentioning, songs like One More Time by Daft Punk, which is still played these days, so it's still popular, and also the evolution of kind of the deep house music to more subgenres like progressive house. So you got artists like Martin Garrix and Avicii on the rise, and although Avicii didn't reach global success until the early 2010s, he was still making music prior to that and developing his own unique sound. And then other groups like Swedish House Mafia were also making music and evolving their own sound, and Deadmau5 was also becoming more popular in the 2000s as well.
And just coming back to you again, Mitch, obviously, as I said, we start to see the emergence of these talent shows like Pop Idol, X Factor, Britain's Got Talent, and we're starting to get this conveyor belt of factory-made pop, stuff that the public wants to see. What impact do you think those talent shows had on popular music, and do you think it was a good thing or a bad thing that it has had the impact it has?
I think it's had a good impact because it's brought more music into the industry, more like it's promoted small artists just through the talent shows. But I would say in regards to electronic music, because a lot of electronic artists are like bedroom producers until they get noticed by a big label. So for example, Alan Walker released his song Faded on NCS, which is a YouTube music label, and he was not known until that song was out, and I think it's got over 1 billion views now on YouTube. So I'd say with the talent shows, it doesn't really benefit electronic dance music artists, but for singer-songwriters, bands, or just vocalists, it definitely gives them a good career. And also for the fans that have obviously voted for them in the shows, they love the music as well, so I think it's definitely beneficial.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, for me personally, I think that talent shows kind of it's led to more watered down pop music, and I think we see a lot of people that go on talent shows that don't particularly care about the music so much as they do enhancing some form of a media career. And we see a lot of people who go on these talent shows who don't necessarily win. They might come third, fourth, fifth, might be not even get through the first round of auditions. But what these talent shows go to show us that if you're a memorable contestant, people remember you, then they can resonate with you and you'll get some kind of career at the end of it.
I think a prime example of that is Ollie Murs. So I think he finished second or third, and he's still releasing music and he's big. But also on the other side of that, where you mentioned about people don't take it seriously, they kind of just vote in because it's entertainment. If someone's not necessarily a good singer but they're funny on stage or something, so Jedward,
Chico, Honey G, Rylan even. I mean, he's a presenter on This Morning now. He's got his own Radio 2 show.
Exactly. So I think it kind of takes the seriousness out of music, and as long as they're being entertaining, they're kind of all funny, they kind of just get voted for, no matter if they're talented or not.
Yeah, and I suppose on the other side of that, you've then got a couple of boy bands that have been fairly successful from it. JLS, I think, finished second or third. One Direction, absolutely, and they've lots of them now have got doing really well solo career wise. Harry Styles certainly massive now, and
Zayn Malik as well.
Zayn Malik, but these are kind of becoming iconic people in the world of music today, and certainly in terms of pop music. Alex, any thoughts on talent shows and what they produce and things?
I'd say it kind of just brings a rise to music being more commercial, in terms of it's not always going to be artistry based, I guess you could say, because you'll have an artist who, as you guys have pointed out, they might not necessarily be the best singer on the talent show, but they have the kind of appeal towards the British public where they just have a lasting memory, really, and so they end up having a career maybe not even in music, just in presenting. But I think I'd want to talk about pop punk as well, because in the late 90s you had a lot of pop punk that got sort of after the heyday of grunge, it became the mainstream rock, really. And then sort of in the 2000s it kind of slowly tapered off a little bit, and I think that's due to the fact that rock as a genre kind of isn't as popular as it used to be.
Yeah.
And so when you have sort of more commercialised stuff, pop punk is very much not supposed to be commercialised, so that I think made it sort of decrease a lot in popularity.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, let's move on now to the 2010s. This is the last era that we're going to talk about. We did discuss talking about the 20s, but having only had a couple of years of that, it's hard to really get a grasp on the decade as a whole. So 2010s, you know, we're starting to see more grime. Rap now is a big thing. You've got artists like Miley Cyrus that are trying to start something fresh, new genres perhaps. We're seeing lots of sub-genres as well. You know, you've got bands like Mumford & Sons who are bringing in new folk. And then also we're seeing YouTube stars get big. So Shawn Mendes now has a massive career from YouTube. Dua Lipa just doing bedroom singing videos. She's now got a massive career. And then you've got YouTubers like KSI who were massive on YouTube and then have transitioned over into music. We're seeing more bedroom producers. You know, DAWs are getting really, really good now, really affordable. So lots and lots of people can use those. It's mainly EDM or singer-songwriters who are using those, but we're seeing a lot more of that. Another thing that we need to talk about is Spotify as well. It's the emergence of a big streaming service which has completely changed the face of music and how we consume it forever. So let's start with grime and rap and the influence that those genres have had on the 2010s and the culture outside of music as well. Mitch, what do you make of that?
I think a lot of people like it's because it kind of went from hip hop to grime, and now it's kind of gone to like drill as well, which is like another kind of genre of like rap, I guess you could call it.
Mm-hmm.
But and also separate from this, but in regards to grime and drill, I think a lot of people listen to the music, or a lot of people produce that music because they're in like suburbs of like London and there's a lot of gang war.
Mm-hmm.
So people just create music sometimes to kind of, I don't know, dig at another like rivalry, and then obviously it gets uploaded to YouTube.
So like diss tracks.
Yeah, and like and even with like YouTubers, like you mentioned with KSI, they were doing diss tracks, but it wasn't like gang related, it was just for views and content.
Mm-hmm.
And they were racking in loads of money just by getting loads of views and like, you know, ad revenue from the videos. But in regards to drill and grime, I think in gang violence, more artists are going to produce music, because not only are they getting paid to kind of diss their rival gang, they're also getting more like a bigger fan base. But with this, when you're going to diss a different gang rivalry, they're going to like have a response. So there's going to be these diss tracks backwards and forwards in like modern rap or like grime music, which I think kind of, although the music is like good music to me, or I like listening to it, I don't think the culture behind it is necessarily correct, or like it shows a decent, like a positive light in music.
Yep. Alex, then, what do you make of these kind of new sub-genres that we're seeing? As I said, bands like Mumford & Sons coming out with new folk and things. Everyone seems to be starting something fresh. Everyone's trying to find that individuality now in the 2010s that was maybe more readily available in the 80s, because no one had kind of done it back then. Now everyone has a genre that they fit into, whether they like it or not. So people are deliberately trying to create these sub-genres. So I was just wondering what you make of that, whether you think it's silly, or you think it's clever, or you think it's people trying to be overly artistic. What do you make of it?
I think it's, going back to what you said about the 80s, I think that's definitely is an influence there, because it seems, although cancel culture is quite a big thing now, it also kind of encourages more self-expression.
Mm-hmm.
So if somebody wants to be a certain way, or they want to have their song in a certain genre but then have other parts from other genres, it doesn't matter. Whereas I guess if they'd done that in the 2000s, they might not have got the commercial success, or the reviews were even quite bad, or whatever really. Whereas now it's kind of like, oh, that's different, that's gonna get more listens, or it's gonna get more appeal.
Yeah.
But it might also inspire more people. So when they're performing live, people think, oh, that's really good. and then more people get on it then, and I think that's really good.
Absolutely, and I think to carve out this individuality as well, people are starting to become more provocative with what they're doing. You know, stuff they're doing at gigs, for example. Katy Perry, I think the California Girls video is super provocative, but it gets views and it gets people listening to the song. Miley Cyrus with Wrecking Ball, she went through a really tough breakup with Liam Hemsworth, and then, you know, she was naked on a wrecking ball speaking very openly in her music about her breakup, but it made people listen and it made people get views. And we're in this era now where if you're not big on social media, or you're not saying something that annoys someone else, then you're not really anybody. So you've got to be provocative, you've got to put yourself out there, say something controversial to make sure that your music is heard, which seems strange, but that's just, I think, the culture that we live in. And it goes back to the old adage of, you know, any press is good press. Even if someone's slagging you off in the newspapers, it's opening up a portal to what you're doing, who you are, and it gets more people to view you, and so you become more popular that way, or more controversial. And I think also a lot of people in the 2010s now almost play a caricature of themselves. You know, KSI, for example, that's not his real name. I don't know what his real name is, but it's not KSI. But KSI is almost a character that he becomes in order to get more views or to get his music out there, because that's what appeals to people. It's that character rather than the person themselves. People are trying to be someone they're not in order to spark a reaction or something. So, okay, spoke a little bit about KSI there. Let's talk about these YouTube stars, or people who use YouTube to record covers and things and have then gone on to become famous. Shawn Mendes, Dua Lipa, KSI, as I said, more towards the late 2010s. Mitch, what do you make of all of that, and do you think it's a good thing that people are being scouted on YouTube?
I think with with having social media and YouTube and apps such as Vine back in the day, and also TikTok now, it's helped to get producers and artists recognised by, you know, label A&R managers, and also just people that are just scouting for more artists to sign. With Shawn Mendes, I'm really happy that he got scouted, because I actually really like his music, and I think it's really good that on YouTube, they're not just focusing on the big labels like Sony, Universal, Warner. That actually, there's people going out there watching videos, and then there's label A&Rs from those smaller labels. Then he's releasing songs with smaller labels, and then getting involved with Sony.
Yeah.
So, and then getting worldwide recognition. I think Stitches has over 2 billion views now, I think, on YouTube.
Which is crazy.
I think it was released in 2016 or 14 maybe.
Yeah, it's mad. Okay, let's talk a little bit about Spotify coming out as well. Obviously, big streaming service. Before that, everyone was buying their music on iTunes or Deezer, which has now practically fallen off the map. And I would say, you know, the majority of people now use Spotify to stream their music. What do you make then? Alex, let's come to you first. What do you make about Spotify kind of changing the game in this way? Do you think it's been a good thing for artists and producers? And do you think it's been good for the way that we consume music as well?
I think definitely in terms of both points that you said, in consumption music it definitely helps a lot more, because you'd have to buy a CD in the past, or people that legally download MP3s, and that's not good for music at all, because the artist doesn't get anything from that. And the problem with CDs was, obviously, you had to have a CD player and they can get scratched, and it's a physical thing. Whereas with Spotify, because it's all digital, you can have an account for it, and you retain your consumption of it essentially, unless it gets taken off there. And in terms of artists, with Spotify, it definitely helps them as well, because they don't have to pay for the production of CDs, they don't have to do really as much artwork, and the artwork's probably going to be easier to do, because you can just upload it straight to a computer and put it on Spotify, as opposed to having to get it printed on an album cover and things like that.
Yeah,
So,
I suppose you can do everything digitally.
yeah,
Can't you?
exactly. It just saves a lot of money and time.
And you can do it from home as well.
Yeah.
You don't need to hire a graphic designer necessarily or anything like that.
Exactly.
You can just, I think being an artist now in the 2010s is all about how much you can do yourself more than anything else. You've got to show that you can do it by yourself first before anyone is really interested in what you're doing. Mitch, what do you make about Spotify and how a massive streaming service kind of changed the game?
I think with Spotify, I really like Spotify, but I think their artist royalty payout is not as much as it could be. Obviously, that's because Spotify is going to take their profit share, then the label's going to take their share, then the publisher's going to take their share, depending on how many people you work with. But not only Spotify as well, what I wanted to mention was SoundCloud and the rise of SoundCloud rappers. So Lil Pump, 21 Savage, Post Malone. With SoundCloud, there's not as much copyright, or it's easier to upload tracks on SoundCloud than it is on Spotify. Because Spotify, you need to go through distribution companies, and they need to approve it, so it goes to two-factor authentication of your own song. Whereas SoundCloud, you can upload whatever media file you want. But I think in regards to SoundCloud, it's really good because it gave artists a career out of music just by uploading their own kind of MP3 tracks originally. And it's obviously popular music because they've got a big fan base and touring. So,
well, let's quick fire question then. You've got a choice: Spotify or SoundCloud. This is a question for both of you. You can only keep one. Which one are you keeping and why? Mitch, we'll come to you first.
Personally, I'd keep SoundCloud, and the only reason for this is because you come across a lot of bootlegs and remixes which are unofficial, unofficial remixes, but they're still made by smaller producers. You can get tracks on SoundCloud that you can get on Spotify, say by Calvin Harris, but it's like that same subscription service. Whereas there's a free subscription to SoundCloud, and you can listen to most tracks that aren't by big artists, so upcoming artists. But even big artists like Martin Garrix, for example, he uploads his tracks for free on SoundCloud. So it's not like he's trying to rake in the money and keep making a profit. So I think if I had to choose one, it would be SoundCloud, mainly because of the unknown talent and the smaller producers that aren't really getting known.
Yeah.
So.
And Alex, Spotify or SoundCloud for you?
For me, it'd be Spotify, but only because you can access, I think, more of the eras of music kind of a lot easier. Because where I do think SoundCloud is really good for the unofficial things, because especially if it's a small artist, you don't really get that with the algorithm on Spotify. It doesn't, unless you pay for promotion on the playlists, it's very difficult to kind of get up the ladder.
Yeah.
But I do think that in terms of for the consumer, it's really good for things like the release radar, and also giving you suggested playlist based on your listening. I use those quite a lot. They have daily mixes where I'll have a chill mix, which will be all the songs you've liked, but it'll give you a selection of those.
Yeah.
So you don't have to make it yourself. So
I think mine is dependent mainly because of the genre I listen to. So because it's electronic dance music, I love listening to bedroom producers that are really talented making remixes. Whereas if I was to listen to rock or heavy metal on SoundCloud, there's not a lot of their tracks that are uploaded.
True.
And also if they are uploaded, it's the most expensive subscription service. Whereas on Spotify you can get all the tracks for the cheapest subscription.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, we've reached the end of our discussion on each of the eras, so now it's time to make a choice. So which era do we think is best for music, and why? Taking in all kind of the social, political, environmental factors that influence the music in each decade, taking into account the equipment that was available, the progression that was made in terms of genres, what do we think is the best era for music and why? Alex, will come to you first.
I'd probably have to go for 80s, just because the variation. Because you've got early Metallica, so you've got thrash metal and things, and Megadeth as well. You've got electronic with your pop and stuff as well, and then you've also got your classic rock as well. And obviously there's so many classic rock bands from the 80s that are still going as well. So yeah, and also the fact that it was rebelling against conformity and just being individuals. That definitely Yeah, that's what I would say though.
Excellent. And I think I'd probably be inclined to agree as well. For me, the 80s is the best era for music because, as you said, there's so much variation. We see style come into it a bit more, but it wasn't as kind of not regulated, but it was more lenient on things in the 80s than maybe it was in the 90s. A lot of electronic music, classic rock, as you said. A lot of music from the 80s is really timeless, and you maybe don't get that in some of the other eras. Certainly not the amount of bands and things that are as timeless. Also, we saw that kind of adaptation from classic rock bands to be more popular. As we mentioned, Kiss. You've got hip hop, punk is really emerging, house music. So yeah, I'd be inclined to agree with the 80s. Mitch, what do you think? Contrasting opinion, same opinion?
I think, surprisingly, I'd choose 1980s. Because
Really?
I listen to a lot of electronic dance music that is contemporary and released recently or within the last 12 years. The only reason I choose the 1980s is because, first of all, I love rock music, but also it was the evolution of house music to deep house, to techno, and then to trance. And I think if house music didn't originate in the 1980s, or maybe didn't get the evolution that it has gotten, then we might not I may not hear the songs that I do today that I really like. So I'd solely choose the 1980s because it was the origin of electronic dance music, personally, for me.
Yeah, and well, there we go. I mean, there we have it. That's kind of a unanimous decision, which I've got to be honest, I wasn't expecting. So the 1980s is the best era for music according to Phoenixx Records. But do let us know what you think in the poll that will be attached to this podcast down below. Let us know on Instagram as well what you think and whether we've made the right choice, and maybe there's something that we missed in one of these eras that you want to let us know about. So do get in touch. But that's all we've got time for today. I'd like to say thanks to my guests, Mitch Abnett and Alex Lee from Phoenixx Records, and we'll see you again soon on Rise Like a Phoenix for episode 3. Thanks very much. Goodbye.